it's very difficult to ask these young men and women to turn down more money than they've ever seen. Again, not just for that particular moment, but also thinking down the line, they're looking at the future and the possibilities.
You know, there's an old saying, if they won't respect you at the ballot box, make them feel it in their pocketbook. I know I've heard that so many times, and that's exactly what the NAACP is doing right now. Just weeks ago, the Supreme Court's 6-3 ruling in the Louisiana versus Calais case gutted what was pretty much left of the Voting Rights Act. So the NAACP is hitting back where it hurts. We're talking about the pocketbook, folks, calling for a boycott of Southern public universities, bringing in over $100 million a year in athletic revenue. Now, while their state, actually their government, strip away Black political power. And that's their message, has been pretty clear. If those states won't protect your vote, then your talent and your money shouldn't be making them rich. Joining me now is Anthony Amey, clinical assistant professor at Carmical Sports Media Institute at the University of Georgia. Anthony, it's been so long, and I want to welcome you to the show.
Brittany, it's always good to be with you. Like I said, it's been too long, but this is an important topic, so I'm glad you reached out.
Absolutely. And so you obviously have students, you have had to have probably a lot of these conversations at this point, or at least have heard from them mentioning some of these things. And so when I think about how I grew up in a household with two athletes, and sports was like the way, it was the ticket to get to college and to be able to build a life for yourself. So Black athletes are often the first in their families to access generational wealth through scholarships. And now we talk about the NIL deals. Is it realistic to ask a young recruit to walk away?
I think that's the, no pun intended, $1 million question, right? It's very difficult, as you mentioned, to find someone who has grown up without means to then be put in a position where he or she can provide a certain amount of means for their family as well as for themselves, and tell them to ignore that. The fact is, many of the states cited by the NAACP have public universities that are able to provide large amounts of cash, not just from the schools, but also from those NIL deals from external sources. And so I'm pretty sure we're in the same boat in that if we were 17, 18 years old and you're getting an offer of this pile of cash to be able to not just participate in the sport that you love, but also have a chance to develop at it with an opportunity to become a professional down the line, it'd be very difficult to turn down.
Yeah, I mean, because like I said, I think about that. I'm like, I know for my brother, it was I got to get a scholarship. This is how I'm going to make it. And we've had conversations about how it's ingrained in you that I got to make it to the NFL. And of course, you know, like what is it, less than 1% that happens
Right,
for, but it still was his ticket to getting the scholarship and to being able to get the money to pay for college. So
right.
what do you say to a kid who is torn in between what should I do when they're hearing all of this messaging right now that's coming from organizations like the NAACP or the National Urban League, and then some of the other Black leaders who are like, no, y'all don't need to go to these schools?
What I would tell them is to study history. I don't know that it is emphasized enough, and it certainly has become sort of de-emphasized by the current administration in Washington, of course, in numerous ways. But study history, and part of that also falls on the parents of these athletes, because grandparents for sure lived part of it. In fact, again, the states that are targeted by the NAACP as those to boycott in terms of support for public universities, flagship institutions in many of those cases. Um, those schools primarily are in the SEC and Southeastern Conference and the Atlantic Coast Conference, the ACC. The SEC is the more dominant of the two in terms of athletic conferences. And in fact, just last year, last fiscal year, the SEC reported $1.1 billion in revenue. And so that's split to a little over 70 million for the 14 oldest member schools to disperse accordingly. Well, when you have that type of bag, quote unquote, staring you in the face, it's difficult to turn down. But if you go back and study the history, again, from grandparents and further back, then understand that those schools weren't always welcoming to us. It was only 60 years ago when the SEC first integrated athletically, and it was a baseball player um, at Tulane, which is no longer in the SEC. So it's only been 60 years. And so many of these current athletes, grandparents, they're still living, they still remember.
Yeah.
But again, how do you turn that down when that opportunity exists? We weren't welcome at those schools as recently as 60 years ago. And so other schools did welcome us, of course, HBCUs, strictly black colleges and universities. And perhaps that might be the path. Those schools also have resources, though they're not certainly as vast as those in some of the larger conferences like the SEC and ACC. But study history and then make a decision in part based on that history to understand the type of impact you can make.
That's such a good point, because I think sometimes people don't see that it's a deeper layer than that. And I think about me going to a PWI, and for those who don't know, a predominantly white institution, and I know they're bringing in tons of money. Like, football is the
Yep.
culture,
Yep.
whatever. Like, that's what we are showing up for and spending our money, whether it's on the merchandise, all types of things that they're just bringing in tons of money. And like you said too, it just makes you think, like, when you're faced with the making all this money versus being like, ooh, I'm gonna decide to go to a school that maybe not bring in the same type. Like, I don't know. I think it's gonna be kind of a hard pull for them to say, I'm gonna stand up for voting rights. But you do have some of them are like, you know what, I'm gonna take a stand.
Well, the general counsel now, the ACP, is Kristen Clark, who had such a gigantic role in the Merrick Garland Department of Justice for her work in civil rights. And she and others recently celebrated the Freedom Riders who formed in Washington, D.C. in the early 60s. And she recently really pointed out just how much of an impact young people can make, because there's this argument or debate as to whether it is fair, as we mentioned earlier, to put such responsibility on young shoulders. Well, many of the people in the civil rights movement, they were the same age. John Lewis, the late great congressman from Georgia, he was 21 years old when he was part of the Freedom Rides, and was one of the first, if not the first, to be beaten in Rock Hill, South Carolina at the age of 21. Well, 2 weeks later, he was on a bus to Jackson, Mississippi. So we understand what his role in civil rights was,
Right.
but people of that ilk, they accepted the responsibility. They wanted the responsibility so that they could be part of change. This great man met Rosa Parks at 17, met MLK at 18, and that began his journey to making lives better for those who looked like him, but also those who came up behind him. And so impact can be made. And
Yep.
I don't think it's too much to ask young people to consider every option and what might not necessarily be great just for them, but also those who are coming behind. All it would take would be one or two really major recruits to say, you know what, I see what's going on,
Yep.
and I'm going to go here instead of to these large universities. Now, will it make a huge dent right away? No, but
Right.
we know how it can take one or two, and then that can start a tidal wave, right? So that tidal wave of change can come just that quickly. But again, as we discussed, it's very difficult to ask these young men and women to turn down more money than they've ever seen.
Yeah.
Again, not just for that particular moment, but also thinking down the line, they're looking at the future and the possibilities. So, for instance, this past April, late April, early May, the NFL draft, there were 7 first-round picks from the SEC, from SEC schools. Last year, there were 15 of 32 first-round picks who were from SEC schools. So these young men are seeing, if I go to that school, I can develop at my absolute best and become an NFL player. As you mentioned, not everybody's going to get there, but they view it as their best chance of getting there if they take the routes of going to some of these larger PWIs and accepting the funds that are provided for them.
This reminds me too, Anthony, probably, I don't remember how many years ago. I think it was back when we were at our former network. And remember where it was it Trump or who told LeBron to kind of stay in his lane? Sports doesn't need to mix with politics. You remember that statement that was made?
Yeah. So, you know what? It goes back even farther than that. It was the 2016 campaign when he was still playing in Cleveland and he was campaigning for Hillary Clinton in Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, one of the battleground states. And it was the Fox News host, Laura Ingraham, infamously said, "Stick to sports." So yeah, that sort of started the snowball for that, and that's just sort of stuck. Yet and still, the people who were so against those like LeBron, they embrace and tout a Jackson Dart who was introducing the president a couple of weeks ago, much to the chagrin of some of his teammates, introducing the president in New York. Jackson Dart now plays quarterback for the New York Giants. He played college football at the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. And so there's so many different things that make up just the sort of explosive nature of all of this that we're seeing right now. And I remember asking my dad was born in 1903. And I remember asking him during the first Trump administration, first Trump term, if he'd ever, if at that time it was the most divided he had seen the country since perhaps the Civil Rights era, Jim Crow. And he said yes, without hesitation. So the whole stick to sports thing, when one person touts or promotes or advocates for someone, but then turning a blind eye when it's someone promoting or touting the preferred choice, it's sort of where we are. And we just have to kind of figure out how best to navigate it.
Yeah, it's like saying it's okay for one and not for the other to mention it. And so that was our thoughts, was like, what should parents be telling their students at this time because of having that experience and knowing that it's like saying Colin Kaepernick can't take a knee, and
Right.
but like you just said, this other guy, it's okay for them to meddle into it. So when is it appropriate for, you think, universities? Do you feel like universities are listening to these, not necessarily demands, but these requests? And do you think there's a possibility for them to actually say, we may make a change?
I think the universities are listening. I think that they are on guard, hoping that it never becomes a tidal wave. So the SEC, for instance, is in the midst of a $3 billion television deal with ESPN. Well, ESPN is not going to pay $3 billion for mediocre athletic competition. And so you can imagine if that tidal wave you spoke of, if there's a tidal wave of resistance and an exodus from the Southeastern Conference by Black athletes, well, there's going to be quite a bit of consternation. There's going to be quite a bit of panic that will set in. I think back to the 1970 Alabama USC football game. USC traveled to Alabama, and behind a running back named Sam Van Cunningham, USC destroyed Alabama, which had always been a perennial power, but at that time was still a team. And again, I mean, we're talking about 56 years ago. Like, it's the age of many people's parents. So not that long ago, and Alabama had an all-white team. Now Alabama's top players are Black players who are being paid the most. by the school as well as by NIL collectives. And so, and again, Black players are flocking to that type of school from all over the country.
Right.
Now, if those players decide, you know what, I don't like the way Governor Kay Ivey is trying to go through with this redistricting map, the Supreme Court just made a decision allowing for gerrymandering in Alabama, overturning the votes of those who cast votes already in an election there. Can you imagine if Black players said, I don't agree with this? Black parents, grandparents said to their sons, daughters, I don't agree with this. Don't go there. And if Alabama fielded a losing team, well, guess what? The governor would have a change of heart. That state legislature would have a change of heart. All of a sudden, they would start embracing it. Much like in 1970, when USC went in and trounced Alabama on the football field, all of a sudden, everyone who was a Crimson Tide fan started to say, you know what, we should welcome Black players. The star on the field that day for the University of Southern California, Sam Cunningham, said years later, he didn't think that white people's views of Black people changed that day, but he realized, or they realized, that Black players would help their football program win games. And so that in itself is exactly what the NAACP is expressing and explaining and trying to get across, is that these young people do have a certain amount of influence and power in their hands. Will they realize it? I don't know. So there's a saying, particularly in football, because there are way more jobs that are available, that if you can play, they'll find you in the NFL. Again, so many young men think they're going to make the NFL, make it to that level, and they go to these bigger schools with the hope that they can develop into that type of player to make more money for their families at some point. Well, first of all, arguably the best wide receiver, there's no argument. The best wide receiver in NFL history is Jerry Rice. He went to Mississippi Valley State, HBCU. Arguably the greatest running back of all time, Walter Payton, went to Jackson State, HBCU. Those two are, without question, two of the greatest of all time, and they never played for PWI. Deacon Jones, arguably the best pass rusher of all time, South Carolina State, Mississippi Valley State, HBCUs. And so talent can be found anywhere. And a couple of guys who are currently in the league, Javon Hargrave went to South Carolina State. He's made over $98 million in his career. Kobe Durant is someone who went to South Carolina State, and he's made over $6.5 million in his career. So just because you go to a smaller school or an HBCU or a non-SEC or ACC school doesn't necessarily mean that you won't make it to the league. However, the perception, and it's a widely held perception at this point, understandably, because of everything we've seen over the last 60 years with integration, the perception is that those bigger schools in the South, in the SEC, will help you develop into a player that can make it. How do you change that perception? That's the big question.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a stronger push for the HBCUs to have to, I don't know. I think they've done their job in terms of making it more appealing, but it's just like trying to be able to push through that phase of being like, this is where you can come. And maybe it's sharing the stats like you just did with where some of these greatest players came out of. And so I think about this. You touched on a number of things, Anthony, in my last question, with the fact that money talks. That's one of them. And we can make that influence. But what would you like to see as far as that perfect balance of strengthening the NAACP's campaign to say, take a stand, right? And then also at the same time, letting the athlete know that you can make whatever the decision is going to be best for you, but also making sure that you're looking out for future generations to come.
It's going to take, again, history lessons, number one. Understanding that there is the ability to make it, even if you do not attend one of these schools that the NAACP is asking for people to boycott. But also, frankly, just a certain amount of strength. Now, obviously, I teach at the University of Georgia. which has a powerhouse athletic program, which has won national championships in various sports. Football team started off this decade winning a couple of national championships. It would be crippling if parents of players and Black players, again, men and women, decided, you know what, we're going to move on. That's not an option for us. It would cripple the athletic program here and at other Southern schools, especially in those flagship institutions that the NAACP is targeting. Considering that, though, there's so many people who are from the state who have state pride, and they don't view it as, unfortunately, they don't view it as I have to pay attention to what's going on with gerrymandering maps. And again, that's where the parents and the grandparents need to have more influence to make their sons and daughters aware this is what's happening. We have to sit down and talk this out and make a choice in tandem with learning about the history, in tandem of learning this is what your influence can be. This is the type of impact you can have. Now, again, it's going to take multiple. It won't be as impactful if it's just one or two, but that one or two can start a tidal wave, and that's something that can really make a major impact at some point.
Anthony, that was amazing. I'm so excited we got a chance to talk about this, because I feel like people have conversations kind of just around the money aspect of it, but not really taking a deeper look into what these young athletes are experiencing. And like you said, going back to the history. And so I hope that this encourages them to kind of take that extra step to say, you know what, I can make a different decision when it comes to this, because it's not just about the sports itself, but it's also about the experience and how you're setting up the next future generation. So Professor Amey, we are so appreciative of you joining to the show and just dropping some good advice for us. We appreciate it and your time.
All right. Good to be with you, Brittany.